where we recovered a motorbike that we believe was used in the shooting and which we now know to have been stolen.
A primary school teacher from Northampton who stabbed her boyfriend to death before burying his body in their back garden will spend at least 20 years in prison. 50-year-old Fiona Beale admitted murdering 42-year-old Nicholas Billingham, whose remains were recovered 4.5 months after he was last seen. Judge Mark Lucraft has passed sentence at the Old Bailey.
Having moved and buried the body in the garden, you then lied to his mother, numerous friends, all his family and yours, as to what you had done and where he was.
2 people have been arrested over a robbery at a jeweller's in southwest London. 2 men put a member of staff in a chokehold and then stole high-value watches in Richmond on Saturday afternoon. The victim, 27-year-old Oliver White, was found dead in Surrey the following day. 500 million Ticketmaster customers may have had their personal details stolen by hackers. Australian authorities say they're trying to find out what happened. Ticketmaster is yet to confirm whether the breach has happened. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 48 points at 82.31. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.18. LBC weather, showers easing this evening, some rain along the North Sea coasts and a low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Ali Miraj.
Ali Miraj on LBC. It's just 2 minutes past 8, and for the next hour, you can let your metaphorical election hair down because Luke Tryl is in the house. Who is Luke Tryl? He's the UK director of More in Common, a think tank which aims to tackle social divisions. He's a pollster as well, a focus group expert extraordinaire. What he doesn't know about the elections, you don't need to know. Basically, any question you've got on any aspect of all of this, he will be able to answer. The policy announcements, the priorities of you, the voters, and whether any of the key campaign messages from the parties so far. I mean, it's been a few days now, right? We're week 1. Yeah, it's Thursday today. 1 week has already elapsed. Whether any of those are cutting through. So you know what to do. Get your calls in now, 0345 6060 973. You can text on 84850 or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Anything in any aspect you want to talk about in relation to the election, which parties are up and down, what are the key issues, what's on your mind, how the issues that matter to you are actually polling and meaning to other voters, all of those things. It's all up for discussion. Get your calls in now. Luke, a very warm welcome to you. A very good evening.
Good evening.
Great to have you here. Just let's take stock, Luke. It's been over a week now since Rishi Sunak did that infamous announcement in the rain against the backdrop of that blaring music. Things can only get better. How is the election going so far after week 1?
Well, one of the things that I can say is that announcement from the Prime Minister in the rain did cut through. In fact, we asked people for their snap reaction to that speech and created a word cloud of the results. And you can guess there was one word right in the middle, which was wet. We then asked the same thing about Keir Starmer. What did you think of his response? And I think Keir Starmer would have been quite pleased with the word in the middle of his, which was change.
I thought he was going to say dry.
No, it wasn't dry. It was it was change.
Okay.
It wasn't all positive. There were some people saying it wasn't that inspiring. It was a bit boring, but it was definitely better than Rishi Sunak's. And I think if you look at the polls, that is the story of the first week. We went in to the general election campaign with Labour about 20 points ahead on average. That's across all the pollsters. There's a bit of a range. We can talk about that a bit more. But you get to today, a week or so in, and it's still 20-ish points. So there hasn't been a narrowing.
And just on the change point, it's very interesting. Do you think that slogan is really cutting through? Do you think it's too simplistic? Because Lord Mandelson, the arch architect of New Labour, one of the Troika, along with Gordon Brown, said it needed to be expanded a little bit, change you can believe in or something like this. Do you think it's too simple, or do you think it's actually working?
Well, I think it's definitely capturing the public mood. So we put to the public, we put the 2 key messages. Is it time for change, or should we stick with the plan?
Yes.
And it was 70-30 for time for change. We then asked about the 2 candidates. We said, is Rishi Sunak change or more of the same. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given he's the PM, about 80% said that he was more of the same. Keir Starmer split right down the middle, 51% change, 49% more of the same. So he's definitely ahead of Sunak on that. But I think the reason it's so split is he's got to do a bit more of a job to convince people, what is that change?
That's really interesting. So
like?
It's not in the bag yet. He's got to do more to convince them what that change is. This is fascinating. I could hog the whole conversation, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go to Sean in Leeds, who's a new caller. Sean, a warm welcome to you. Good evening. What would you like to ask Luke?
I'd like to ask him about immigration.
Yep.
Instead of having all these policies about how we stop them coming and they're coming for this and coming for that, why don't we stop what they're really coming for, which most people feel is the benefit system? Forget them, let them come in the boats, but they don't get a penny when they get here.
Okay, interesting, interesting, Sean. Thank you for that. Luke, what have you done around focus groups and polling around the immigration issue?
Well, we ask people on a weekly basis, what are going to be the top issues in deciding your vote? And it won't surprise you, number one, cost of living. Number two, NHS. Number three, and it is a bit further back than those two, is immigration. So it is definitely an issue which matters to lots of voters, particularly matters to those who voted Conservative in 2019.
Yep.
But the interesting thing when you're talking focus groups to people about immigration is that basically no one's happy. No one thinks that the current system is really working. Those who want tighter controls think we're not doing enough to have a sort of orderly system that works. Those that want more immigration think the current system doesn't work because, particularly refugees are left in limbo for long periods of time. But to Sean's point, I think what there definitely is a sense that, people are happy for people to come here and contribute. And I think that sense of contribution and putting back into the system is really important. I think where people get cross is this sense that, people who come and are seen to take out of the system without putting back. So very definitely something that resonates is that idea of, Britain is a welcoming country, but we expect everyone to do their bit.
Sean, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I employ several people from all over the world, and then my family's of different mixed races. But every person who comes here, as long as they put into the pot, they can take out the pot. You shouldn't be able to take out the pot when you put nothing in the pot.
Okay, so Luke does focus groups and polling all the time, Sean. If he's polling you in a focus group of one, what message do you want to be hearing from the parties on immigration in this election, Sean?
Mine will be that people are welcome, who can bring something to the table. Anybody who's coming illegally, they don't get anything in benefits. Interesting. That will be mine.
And thank you, Sean. And just on that, Luke, have you heard any sense in your focus groups about some of the measures that the government's taken to increase the salary thresholds, trying to get higher skilled, higher wage immigration into? Is that cutting through at all, or is it too complicated an issue?
It is a bit. People know that the government is trying on this. The problem is they just don't think they're succeeding.
Yes.
They don't think it's resulting in either lower numbers of legal migrants or stopping the boats when it comes to people who are travelling here against the law. So that's the challenge.
Understood. John in Stockport in Greater Manchester. Good evening, John.
Good evening, guys. Good evening, Luke. I just want to ask a question. I'm going to be a bit greedy because I've got sort of three questions.
Go on.
The first one is regarding a hung parliament. Please, could you explain to people in this country how the Tory party, if there was a hung parliament with a minority, could rule the country?
Okay.
Secondly, does he believe that 16-year-olds should have the vote?
Yep.
And does he believe that voting should be compulsory?
Very interesting. Very interesting. In whichever order you want, Luke.
Well, let's start with a hung parliament. The first thing to say is on current polls, we are not heading for a hung parliament. The current polling, it looks like we're heading for what could be quite a sizable majority. But of course, no one's cast a vote yet. So it could narrow in between. But I think John's point is right. The Conservatives would find it quite hard if it were in a hung parliament to find coalition partners, because the Lib Dems unlikely to go with them again.
They've ruled it out.
The SNP obviously not going to go with them. So I think unless it is a Conservative majority, or it's close enough that they can rely on the DUP again, like they did after 2017.
Didn't work out too well.
It didn't work out too well, but that's the only way. So I think if it's a hung parliament, we can expect Keir Starmer Prime Minister. On votes at 16, we tend to find that the public are more opposed opposed to votes at 16.
That's very interesting because obviously it came out just a couple of days ago that it's probably going to be in the next manifesto. Keir Starmer's given a direction of travel that he wanted. And I thought it was a pretty smart move if you're a Labour strategist to try and secure a second term.
It might be, but it might be better to be the sort of thing that you do during the term rather than doing it in an election campaign.
Yeah.
And on compulsory voting, I think it's a good idea. It's not something that we've asked people about, but one of the things which I think could be an issue in this election is we know that lots of people say they're done with the Tories. They're not necessarily that enthusiastic about Labour. It wouldn't surprise me if this were one of the lowest turnout elections that we've seen in recent years because of that cynicism and apathy.
Luke, I think you're being a little polite because I did actually read one press release on your website that, and I quote this, it says, the public would be happier to find a fiver on the pavement than vote Labour. I mean, it's not exactly a ringing endorsement, is it?
No, it's not. So we tested a whole series of things and asked how happy people would be. And what we found out was that they'd be as unhappy if the Conservatives won as they'd be unhappy if it rained this weekend, but not as unhappy as if they stubbed their toe. And when it came to Labour, they were about as happy as being given tickets to Glastonbury, but as you say, not as happy as finding a fiver, and obviously not as happy as winning the lottery or England winning the Euros.
Thank you, Luke. John, have you decided how you're going to vote yet?
Yeah, I've always been a Labour person, but I just wanted to just say one last thing
Go on.
to your panel.
Go on.
Was he saying, I'm saying, if you're a citizen of a country, and I'm very passionate about this, if you're born and brought up here or you get citizenship of this country and you're a citizen, right, you should be mandatory to vote because you need to have a say in what's going on in the country. But if you're saying you're a citizen and you don't vote, then I don't think you should be a citizen, and I think your citizenship should be taken away from you.
Very interesting. Controversial, John, but a very interesting perspective. Thank you for it. Ranjit in Albury, good to hear you. What would you like to ask, Ranjit?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Ali. Hello, Luke here. I'd like to ask Luke here, if Reform are such a formidable opponent, why aren't more people defecting to him, but they're defecting directly to Labour from the Tories?
I think it's a really good question. One of the big challenges that we've had as pollsters is that we're finding that a lot more people say in opinion polls that they're backing Reform UK than Reform UK actually gets votes when they stand. So if you look at the by-elections we've seen, you'd have expected Reform UK to be doing quite a little bit better than they've done if their poll ratings are real. And I think there's a risk that Reform UK, based on what we're seeing in the polling, finding in figures group, find themselves squeezed as the election campaign goes on. And I think, in direct answer to Ranjit's question, I think people know that ultimately at the end of the day, it's a choice between two prime ministers. Either Keir Starmer is going to be Prime Minister or Rishi Sunak hangs on.
Do you think that Richard Tyson Reform have missed a trick here in actually not trying to, however difficult it is, strike some sort of accommodation with the Tories in a similar way, although the Labour and the Lib Dems would never accept that there is any sort of pact going on, but they were being quite tactical in where to deploy their resources, let's put it that way. Do you think that there should have been some sort of pact, formal or informal, between Reform and the Tories?
Well, I certainly think if Reform wanted to get any seats, they would have to do it through the Conservatives standing down. Whether the Conservatives would accept that, I very much doubt. But I wonder, when you hear Richard Tice speaking, he talks a lot about basically actually wanting to defeat the Conservatives. I don't think he minds if they go down. And there is some truth to that, because we've done some analysis which shows that for every 100 votes that Reform gets, they take 60 from people who voted Conservative in 2019 and just 5 from people that voted Labour. So even if Reform don't win a single seat, they help Labour by 55 votes for every 100 they get.
Ranjit, do you recognise that? Is that making sense to you, what Luke is saying? It certainly resonates with me. What do you think, Ranjit?
It does resonate with me, but the big problem that Reform got, and when they have the next version of Reform, is Nigel Farage. Because 7 times he's lost, right? And now he's still being part of it. And I think people have given the boot to Nigel Farage, especially over Brexit. And if he was to come out of the Reform, not even be an honorary member, I think they might stand much more of a chance, because all he is a foghorn, in my opinion.
Well, Ranjit, it's interesting because he's saying he's not going to stand in this election because ostensibly there's not enough time, but he says he has one big comeback left in politics, but he's not telling us what it is. Maybe it's ambassador to the US under a Trump regime. We don't know. Or maybe it's US ambassador to the UK under a Trump regime. No idea. Ranjit, thank you for your call. I'm with Luke Tryl, a UK director of More in Common, a think tank which aims to tackle social divisions. But also Luke is a pollster and expert in focus groups. And you can hear he's across it all. So if you have a question on any aspect of the election, and look, it is important. I know it's warming up now. I know some of you may not have got into it yet, but it's going to be upon us before you know it. And campaigning is already vigorously taking place. What do you think? Ask them anything you want. You might want to ask also about the Labour Party's current travails with not only Diane Abbott, but also another candidate now who has been prevented from standing, going down a bit like a lead balloon on the left of the party at the moment. What do you think about that? You can ask about that. You can ask about the NHS, the economy, any aspect that you want. Do get your calls in now. 0345 6060 973, text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Luke Tryl on LBC. It's 8:17.
This is LBC. This is LBC with Ali Miraj. Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Ali Miraj on LBC. It's 8:19. I'm in conversation with Luke Tryl, UK director of More in Common, the think tank. He's also a pollster and all across every aspect, literally every aspect of what's happening in this election. What he does not know, you do not want to know, or you do not need to know. Get your calls in. Mike, I'm going to come to your call in a second. By the way, the number is 0345 6060 973, as you know, and you can also text on 84850. Ben from Harrogate has asked this. I'd love to ask Luke how he thinks tactical voting will impact this election. Will it be as big as in 1997? Now, that's a pretty interesting question.
It's a really interesting question. And what we've seen in the by-elections we've had to date over the course of this parliament is that voters have been very savvy at knowing who is best placed to beat the Conservatives. Yes. So in the ones that the Lib Dems have won, for instance, in Somerton, the Labour vote collapsing, people going to the Lib Dems to beat the Tories. But in other seats, it's gone the other way round. You know, Wellingborough, there the Liberal Democrat vote very small as people go to Labour. And if that translates into the general election, and there's some sign it might. We think about 16% of Labour voters, for instance, say they would vote for the Lib Dems if they were clearly in second place. If that sort of thing happens, it could turn, a Conservative defeat into an absolute landslide loss. So I think the potential is definitely there because voters seem savvier than ever.
I remember those those Lib Dem leaflets, Luke, which always used to have, it's a 2-horse race, with these very strange bar charts, right? Basically making this point, hammering this tactical point home that if you want to kick out the Tory, you've got to vote Lib Dem. And that seems to be coming through. Mike in Norwich, good evening.
Hiya, how's it going, everybody?
Fine.
I'd just like to ask, do you not think that either party saying that they would have a referendum on Brexit on their first day in office would walk this election? The reason I say that, I mean, there's 60 million people living in this country. There must be at least 10 million people new to the electoral roll who didn't have a say in Brexit, young people, plus the older population who have passed on. I cannot believe it was so close that many years ago with an influx of maybe 5 or 10 million new votes, why it is not first thing on the list, given how Brexit's gone.
Well, Mike, you're also, it's very good because you're also nicely preempting my third hour, which is going to be on exactly this issue, to keep your radio locked, as they say. On dance music radio stations, Mike. But Luke, to the critical point that Mike is making, why is no one talking about this? I mean, Mike's right. A lot of people have come into the electoral roll now since that referendum that took place that would potentially vote to rejoin.
Yeah, and look, if you ask people, has Brexit worked? Not only do Remainers say that it hasn't worked, Leavers actually now say that it hasn't worked as well. But that's very different to having another referendum.
Yes.
And when we talk about the idea of a referendum in focus groups, you can see lots of people's eyes filling with dread. The thought of going back to those rows we had 2017 to 2019. And it's also worth remembering, when Boris Johnson won in 2019 with that Get Brexit Done slogan, if you dig into it, it was as much the done bit as the Brexit bit that was the reason he won. Because people were just sick of it. They really want politics to go away. So I think that's why the parties, for now at least, are avoiding it, because it might trigger with voters that sense, God, we're going to go back to all the chaos.
And Luke, was there a feeling also with the done part of Get Brexit Done last time, which is a very catchy slogan, that people had voted, and irrespective of whether political class liked it or not, they felt that they were prevaricating, ignoring and frustrating the will of the people for many, many years?
Well, absolutely. And of course, it was one of the drivers that led to that big swathe of seats across what's known as the Red Wall,
yes.
Traditionally Labour seats switching to the Conservatives. In large part, that was, but we sent a message to Westminster, and now they're trying to ignore or subvert that message.
Yes.
So I don't think it would have the same salience now, but I think it would be more that sense of we just don't want to go back to all the rows about Europe.
Mike, are you disappointed that none of the main parties are really focusing on this issue?
Yeah, very.
Oh, Mike, go on.
There's a huge amount of apathy in this country. People literally cannot be bothered with the fact that there's even an election taking place, because we hear these pathetic arguments about, we're going to subsidise privatised rail, for Labour or small, and they're minuscule matters, whereas Brexit was so massive, and that's why people are so apathetic.
Okay.
So they're so apathetic.
No, they are. Mike, sorry, your phone line is also rather apathetic, so we're losing you. But we got the principle of what you were saying. Thank you very much indeed, Mike, for your call. Matthew, another new caller in Hackney. Warm welcome to you, Matthew. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, I was just wondering, the Greens had their election launch today, and with all of the left Labour candidates being kind of kicked out, what Luke thought the prospects were for the Greens in this election.
Very interesting question. How are the Greens doing?
It is an interesting question. And I certainly think, there are a number of seats across the country where you could see some quite big Green performances. So Brighton, of course, they already have one MP there, Caroline Lucas, standing down. If you look at the polling, you'd expect them to hold that seat. Really going after Bristol Central.
Okay. We need to be a bit more careful about the constituencies, but generally speaking, there are some.
There
are certain constituencies. Otherwise, we'll have to bore everyone with the whole list. But the point you're making is that there are certain areas where they are actually playing quite well.
But there are areas of the country where they are challenging Labour in particular. And what we think is they could, assuming Labour win, end up playing a similar sort of role to the role that Reform UK have played for the Conservatives in office. I don't think they will cost Labour many seats in the run-up to this election, looking at the polling, but afterwards they could become a real force.
I hate to use this term, the Muslim vote, because I think it's a bit derogatory derogatory to assume that anyone of any religious background votes as a bloc. But for the purposes of this particular conversation, in certain constituencies, there does seem to be, let's just say, a mood amongst some members of the Muslim populace, or at least supporters of the Palestinian cause, let's put it that way, to punish Labour. And we saw a little bit of that in the local elections. Do you think, Luke, that it's going to make any material difference? Because as I understand, there are only about 10 seats in the country where this would really play out.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt there is some frustration when we do focus groups with members of the Muslim community, not just about Israel-Gaza, but a sort of general sense of neglect by the Labour Party. But when you look at the priorities of Muslim voters, actually, it's very similar to all voters.
Yes.
Number one, cost of living. Number two, the NHS. Actually, Israel-Gaza comes about fourth. So that's one issue. But the second point, and I think, you alluded to this, is it tends to be that Muslim voters are concentrated in certain seats rather than spread out. And we did some analysis which showed that if Labour get the swing that they need to win their 100 target seats, the Muslim vote, share of the Muslim vote would have to fall to 30% for them to lose more than 3 of them.
Understood.
So it requires a massive drop, which I don't think we're seeing yet.
Matthew, brief comment from you.
I just guess anecdotally, it seems that a lot of people are not very enthusiastic about Keir Starmer's Labour and annoyed about the kicking out of left-wing candidates. And I agree that it will be if Labour win a majority, then the Greens could play that similar role.
Matthew, let me ask you: would you say that typically you're a Labour voter, or how would you normally vote, and how are you thinking about voting?
I voted for in different ways, I guess, on that side of the political spectrum.
And how are you? How are you as a voter? Because you are in a constituency which might be affected by this. I mean, how do you see the way that certain figures have been treated in the Labour Party, particularly on the left? We don't have to get into the details, but we all know the things. We're all reading the papers. How do you think that's playing out, Matthew, as a voter?
I find it really disgraceful, to be honest. And also as a Jewish person, I find the way that anti-Semitism has been weaponised by the Labour Party really problematic. I think anti-Semitism is a real and growing problem, but the way that it's been used to kind of quell the Palestinian cause, to attack candidates of the left, I think it's really unsettling, and it actually does a massive disservice to Jewish people. I find it really problematic, and I definitely think it will influence the way a lot of people vote, and also the way a lot of people engage with the Labour Party after the election as well.
Are you not convinced that Starmer has actually tried to deal with the problems of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that his predecessor had sort of presided over, and we had that Equality and Human Rights Commission report? Are you not comfortable that he's done enough, or what is your feeling about it?
I guess my feeling is that he's done a lot of action, but that these kind of actions seem to be wholly disproportionate. And actually, I think he's using anti-Semitism as cover for playing a kind of factional war on the left, ultimately.
That's very interesting.
So I think there's definitely a problem with anti-Semitism on the left, as there is in the rest of society, but the way that Keir Starmer's dealt with it has felt kind of tokenistic at best, but factional, really, and I think that's quite dangerous.
Very interesting. Thank you, Matthew. Just on the anti-Semitism point, Luke, clearly Keir Starmer has tried to change the perception of his party since his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. He's tried to drag the party totally and deal with this anti-Semitism issue. What are your focus groups telling you about the perception of the fact that Starmer has changed his own party?
Well, very definitely the general view that we get from swing voters in our focus groups is that Keir Starmer is more suitable to be Prime Minister than Jeremy Corbyn. And they do think that anti-Semitism was a real issue. They're glad Starmer has taken steps to tackle it. They're not convinced he's fully got rid of it, and they think there's more work to do. So I think that has been important, well, obviously morally, but also for the electorate. The one thing I would say is we have also been asking focus groups specifically about Diane Abbott and what has happened there. Yep. And actually the reaction there has been much more negative. In fact, we had a focus group tonight where people were saying, if he does that to someone on his own side, what is he going to do to us when he's in office? There was a sense that he's sort of letting his own team down. Some commenters have said this, suggested the ruthlessness is good. That isn't what we're hearing from voters. It's this sense of, does he have principles? Someone else said, well, he used to be Jeremy Corbyn's right-hand man, and now he's kicking Diane Abbott out. So I think there's some risk to being seen to overplay this.
That's very, very interesting. I'm going to pick some of that up after the break. You're listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Luke Tryl, Director of More in Common. We're talking about the election. We're talking about all aspects of it. If you want to get a call into Luke, he's still here for another half an hour. And it's a thoroughly interesting conversation. 0345 6060 973. You can text on 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Get your calls in now. And now at 8:31, the news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The Conservatives are accusing Labour of flip-flopping on its VAT pledge, but the Shadow Chancellor says she won't increase the tax. Elsewhere, the Lib Dems are promising to fund mental health services in schools, and Reform UK is calling on an employer immigration tax. A primary school teacher has begun a 20-year prison sentence after murdering her partner and burying his body in their garden. 50-year-old Fiona Beale killed Nicholas Billingham, who was 42, in 2021, but carried on sending texts from his phone. And police say a 9-year-old girl's fighting for her life in hospital after being shot by someone on a motorbike in East London last night. She was at a restaurant in Hackney when she was injured, along with 3 other people. LBC weather: showers easing this evening, some rain along North Sea coasts and a low of 7 degrees.
This is LBC. Ali Miraj on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Ali Miraj on LBC, it's 8:35. I'm in conversation with Luke Tryl, UK Director of More in Common, the think tank. He's also a pollster and speaks to focus groups all the time. He's completely across what's happening in the election, and we're having a fascinating conversation. So do get your calls in on any aspect that you want to discuss in the election. It could be policies, it could be the party leaders, the perception, the infighting, how it's playing out in the focus groups and in the country, what the polls are telling us. Any of it. 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Christoph in Wembley Park. Good evening.
Hi there. So I'd like to ask whether there's any information or any data available on how much voters respect people who vote differently from them.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. Yeah. Is there?
There is. One of our missions actually is tackling social division and supporting people to recognise that you can have different points of view, but not necessarily, disrespect each other as a result of that. And we find that, if you ask people, do we have more in common than what divides us? You get clear majorities in favour of it. That in general, the public say, I like to have a discussion with someone. I like to debate with them. Where it tips over is where it becomes personalised. And I think what people don't like, and we hear this a lot in focus groups, is some of the kind of yaboo politics that you see in Westminster. They don't think, PMQs, for instance, is the way to go about it. They'd much rather just have a discussion.
We're not saying that the Scottish Parliament's the way to go about it. It's like watching paint dry.
Well, perhaps if more of them watch the Scottish Parliament, they might have another point of view.
But do you think, on a serious note, Luke, that when you look at the amplification of these views on social media and things, that there's actually very little really proper debate or nuanced debate going on, and most of the time, or often now, if you disagree with someone, they don't just think that you have a different point of view, they actually genuinely think you're evil.
What you've got to remember, though, is that is a really small minority of people. Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, not Britain. We know that. And the really interesting is if you look at the profile of people who post political content on X, we've got some data on this, it's really skewed towards the extreme. So there's a small minority who do think that, they do demonise their opponents. But most of the country, to be frank, aren't that engaged. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier. They'd be far happy with England winning the Euros than they would with a general election result. And that disengagement in some ways is quite a good thing, because it means that they don't get as personally invested in, as you say, demonising, thinking people are evil. They just approach it as one of those things in life.
They're calling LBC. They're not on X. They're calling LBC. Christoph, quick comment from you. Surely you're not thinking badly of people who disagree with you. What's your perspective, Christoph?
I do my best. I do my best. It's sometimes tough, but it seems that all was overturned during Brexit. And I think maybe that's another reason why people are so reluctant to come back to it, because it was personalised so much, because people were described as stupid or moaners.
They were. Christoph, I'm glad you raised this point, because I think we all have a responsibility, a personal responsibility, to try and deal with that and actually try and dial down the rhetoric and actually deal with each other with decency, robustly, sure, but with decency. Thank you, Christoph, for that. Chris in Cowbridge in South Wales. Good evening.
Good evening, Ali. Thank you for taking my call.
Pleasure.
I have a question for Luke. It's not as deep as or profound as some of your other callers, but my question is with the following: is regarding the language of MPs, specifically the messaging words like plan and change. My question is really, is the word plan that's used so repetitively by the Conservatives, does it actually work? Is it cutting through? Because I find it intensely irritating.
Go on.
It is a really good question. So what we find is so few things cut through from politics that those of us who are interested in it or following it say, we've heard that so many times. Why are they still saying it? Another one is Keir Starmer saying that his dad was a tool maker. We did a poll on that. Only 11% of the public had heard it. So politicians have to keep on saying these things, even when it bores us to tears. But the interesting thing on plan is, I can see what they're trying to do, because from the focus groups, we know people want stability. They want a sense that we've moved out of a difficult period and that the government know what they're doing. I think the challenge for the government is when we tend to ask about this in focus groups, and it was a classic example last night in a marginal seat where we were doing a focus group, and someone said, it's all very well, I like the idea of a plan, but what plan have they got? So I think that's the challenge they face.
That's a much, much bigger point. Thank you for your call, Chris. Gary Leytonstone, good evening.
Good evening. Yeah, I'd just like to know what focus groups think of the reintroduction of national service.
Fantastic question. Yeah.
Just bearing in mind that the last people to have done national service now would be over 70, because it finished in 1963.
Yeah, Gary, thank you, Gary. Good question.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some polling on this, which came back just yesterday. So it's fresh polling on public opinion on national service. And actually, people are split down the middle. We found 40% of people were in favour, 36% opposed. But as you might guess, there were some big age gaps in that polling. So younger generations, what's called Gen Z, those who are sort of 18 to 26, much more likely to be opposed. Those who are older, sort of baby boomer generation, who didn't often do national service themselves, quite like the idea. When we dug into that in our focus groups, what supporters tended to say was, well, it'll teach young people respect, it'll teach them skills, it's a good thing. Well, the young people we spoke to in focus groups tended to say, is, well, if it's that good, why doesn't everyone do it as well? So that's the split.
How did it go down with Conservative voters?
It went down well with Conservative voters. In fact, there is a particular type of voter that we've identified. We've called her Whitby woman. And she is someone who voted Conservative in 2019, now says she doesn't know how she'll vote. She's got an average age of about 61. The Conservatives need to win her back to avoid a landslide. And surprise, she really likes this policy. Well, over 60% support.
Doesn't surprise me. Gary, are you in favour of it?
No, I'll tell you why. I joined the army at 16. I was what they call a junior leader.
Yep.
The regular army. Went on to go to battalion. There was a lot of bullying and violence there from people much older than us. When we joined battalion, we was known as the new draft.
Okay.
I wouldn't allow my children to be entrusted by any drill sergeant, sergeant major, lance corporal, or anything like that. And the fact of the matter is, what I'm really hoping this will do is get the people out, because there's no evidence that it will make society better. People who go in the army commit crimes, do all sorts of things. So why there's this assumption, this rose-tinted view of the past that never really was, that everybody who did national service came out and was a really decent citizen? It's absolute nonsense.
Well, it's interesting, Gary, you say that. I think what the Prime Minister would say is that there's a concern about social division, about bringing people together, about community cohesion, and also about skills. And Onward, the think tank, had done a report into this, saying that they'd done some polling and found that some young people, at least, not all, of course, wanted to actually gain some skills, and this could be a good way of doing it. Gary, thank you for your call. Rick, a new caller in Romford, a warm welcome to you, Rick. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for taking my call. Am I right in thinking there's a lot more emphasis on the party leaders in recent elections than in the past?
Oh, yeah.
I'm just thinking in sort of days gone by, they used to have like sort of like the news briefing first thing in the morning where there'd be a range of cabinet members or shadow cabinet members. And now it just seems to be like really focused on the leaders, almost to the exclusion of virtually everyone else.
Well, also, there's going to be the first leaders debate, which is only going to be with Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak next Tuesday. Luke?
There's definitely a complaint that our election campaigns have become overly presidential, as they're called. And from the Conservatives, this is meant to be quite a deliberate strategy, because you remember when Rishi Sunak came in, even though the Conservatives were doing badly in the polls, his personal popularity was higher. And the hope was he could drag up the Conservative brand with a focus on him. Unfortunately, so far, the opposite has happened. Rishi Sunak's personal ratings have fallen. We have him on about minus 34% approval at the moment. And so going in with a presidential campaign from Rishi Sunak is quite difficult. Flip side, of course, is that Keir Starmer's ratings aren't particularly stellar. He's on +4 at the moment, so it's just positive, but it's not overwhelming. And so you've got two people who, will be debating each other next week, neither of whom are particularly convincing to the public. So as you say, it's slightly odd to have a presidential campaign with two candidates that, at best, people are a bit meh about.
Indeed. Luke, quick one from John here. Just a quick thought. Do low turnouts favour the Conservatives?
So traditionally, Conservative voters are more likely to turn out to vote because they tend to be older, and we know that older people are more likely to vote. But that doesn't necessarily hold. For instance, we thought that when the voter ID requirement was introduced, it would mainly hit younger people. We've actually heard lots of reports of older people being hit by it as well because they don't have the right documentation. So it's difficult to say. But in general, in our polling, when we set a higher turnout threshold, it tends to lead to a lower Labour lead.
Thank you very much, Luke. You're listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Luke Tryl. We're talking about all things related to the election. It's really, really interesting. We've covered a lot of ground so far. Still got about 15 minutes or so. Luke is here. Do get your calls into him on any aspect of the election that is interests you, is bothering you, is keeping you up at night, is frankly downright irritating you completely. 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Ali Miraj in conversation with Luke Tryl on LBC. It's 8:45.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation with Ali Miraj. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Ali Miraj on LBC, it's 8:48. I'm in conversation with Luke Tryl, UK Director of More in Common, the think tank which aims to tackle social divisions, also a pollster as well. We're having a really interesting discussion about all things to do with the election. And you can get your calls in for the remainder of the hour. 0345 6060 973. You can text on 84850 or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Just a couple of texts before I come to you, Des. Nikki from Kent says, for the first time in my long life, I'm not voting because not one of the parties is talking about Brexit, which has damaged the country economically, politically and socially. So I'm not voting. Why are they not talking about the big elephant in the room, which is Brexit? Nikki, you're preempting my final hour. Thank you very much indeed for doing that. You did it in a much more eloquent way than I could have. So thank you. And David says, Ali, can your guest tell us what a point is in poll terms? Is it 1 out of 100? Is a point ahead 1%? What is the formula, says Dave in Aston?
Well, on that, so when we report back opinion polls, we report them as percentages out of 100.
Yes.
So we will say Labour is on 42%, Conservatives might be on 40%, for instance. The point then is the gap between the two of them. So If Labour are on 42, the Conservatives are on 40, there is a 2-point difference between them. And that's how we tend to report the lead. So percentages for the party shares, points for the difference between them.
Interesting, very clear. Thank you for that. Des in Hampton, good evening.
Oh, good evening. This is a sort of bugbear of mine. What I don't understand is why is Keir Starmer running scared of a wealth tax if you promote it as being targeted at, say, the top 0.1% of the populations in terms of top earners? I'll fall in that category, okay? Let's imagine he says we're going to basically top slice at 50% all assets above 10 million. That would prove incredibly popular and would provide fantastic revenue and would not be a vote loser. Why didn't he do that?
Well, someone's got to be on the side of the millionaires, Des. Yeah, why is he not doing it, Luke?
Well, I think Des makes a really interesting point, because when you ask people about increasing taxes on the ultra-rich, there is broad support, as he says, right across the electorate. But I think the challenge with that, and what Keir Starmer will be worrying about, is what happens if the business community starts attacking him. You know, he spent a lot of time trying to woo the business community. What happens when the Conservatives say, you know, they try and say that this will bring in more people than Keir Starmer's saying. And I think their whole strategy has been trying to distance themselves from that high tax image under Jeremy Corbyn. So even though people might support the specific policy, the vibe, as we sometimes call it, that it might give off is this going back to kind of same old high tax Labour?
Are you, Des, are you convinced by the Labour tax policy so far? Because we haven't really heard much apart from a non-dom clampdown. We've heard about the VAT on private school fees. We haven't really heard that much, have we?
No, it's all very weak. It's all very insipid. Like, no, I have fallen at the top 0.1%. No, I am pretty wealthy, not massively wealthy, but that tax would affect me. I have children in private school, so all that stuff. I'll still be voting Labour. But what saddens me is Starmer's lack of what I don't refer to, a male person's genitalia, but you know what I mean.
No, fine. We get the picture. No, I really actually don't want to get the picture, but yeah, I understand your point, Des. We've got the idea. You're disappointed. You want to hear more. I'm afraid I don't think you're going to hear more because they don't want to scare the horses, as Luke says, particularly on the business community, where they got over 100 signatures just only a couple of days ago when they launched their business side of their campaign. But we shall see. Des, thank you for your call. This is an interesting one. Luke, do you look into the effectiveness of ad campaigns? I saw a YouTube advert from the Conservatives which very much seemed to push the narrative that you should vote for Rishi rather than the Conservatives.
That's really interesting. So we have started doing a little bit of work tracking the ad campaigns. What we will often do in focus groups is we will play ads to the people in the focus group and say, what did you think about that? How did it affect you? And what we're also doing is starting to look a little bit more about who is on TikTok and who is spending money advertising on there and who's watching, because I think that is a big unknown of this election. There is much more advertising on places like TikTok, on Instagram as well, because they know that's where a group of voters are and where they get most of their news from, apart from LBC.
Well, indeed, thank you for the plug. It's interesting because if indeed people are pushing the party leaders specifically, I also recall, I think it was last year, that Labour had come out with a bunch of attack ads very specifically on Rishi Sunak, which I thought were a little bit close to the bone and a bit of bad taste, to be fair. But attack ads seem to work.
Sometimes attack ads work. I have to say, we tested those particular
How did they go down?
ads. They actually went down quite badly with swing voters, because swing, if you remember, it was things like, he is letting people who've murderers out of prison.
No evidence for that at all.
And there is one thing I can say about the British electorate. They are very fair-minded. And the response we got was, well, you can criticise him if crime's rising, but he's not responsible for those people. That's judges and other people that do that. So they were quite cross. So yes, attack ads can work, but there's a limit to their effectiveness if they're seen as, just not cricket.
Understood. Kobe, a new caller in Thirsk in North Yorkshire. Warm welcome to you. Good evening.
Hello. Well, recently, of course, a lot of young people have been voicing their concerns about Labour being a lot less left-wing than it is in previous elections. What I wanted to know was how has this affected the support of Green Party in young people, particularly 18 to 27-year-olds?
Very interesting question.
Well, there's no doubt that the Green Party are making gains with young people, and they're trying to offer something a bit more radical to try and excite people. And in focus groups, younger people will talk about the Greens. It's interesting, though, that when people do talk about the Greens in focus groups, it tends not to be because of Gaza. In fact, we've done a few focus groups, and people had no idea what the Greens stance on Gaza was. Sometimes it's not even about the environment. It's actually people will say, we just want something different.
Yeah.
We're disillusioned with what we've got, and the Greens offer something different. But as I say, I don't think Labour should be too worried, because we've got a model which looks at the most progressive voters. These are the voters who are the biggest fans of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. And Labour have ticked down with that group, but they've ticked down from 67% of them to 60%.
Now, just on that ticking down point, because it ain't over, as I say, till the lady living with obesity sings, right? I don't want to offend fat people. The point is here that today you've had Angela Rayner talking about Diane Abbott, saying that she can't see why she can't stand in this election. Labour have got 20 points ahead in the polls. They've been so careful, so assiduous, not to put a foot wrong, to not put a target on their back, and yet in the middle of an election campaign, they've got a whole hoo-ha going on about their candidate selection, and also whether they're causing deep offence and potentially on grounds of race issues to one of their oldest MPs.
Absolutely. I think it's a real risk for Labour, having run such a disciplined campaign up until now. And I think Angela Rayner intervening is quite significant. And why do I say that? It's because whenever we do focus groups, particularly in more red wall areas with more working class voters, and we say, is there a politician who you think gets it? Very often they struggle. But when they do pick someone, very often it's Angela Rayner. And she cuts through to a different type of voter to the voters that Keir Starmer can cut through. And so I think her intervention is significant. But as I say, the other thing which we're getting from our focus groups is that the treatment of Diane Abbott is sending a message about Keir Starmer himself. It's having people say, this isn't cricket, this isn't how you treat your own side. What does it mean for what he's going to be like as Prime Minister?
Does it also play into the fact, Luke, that people look at the infighting within the Conservative Party and it's deeply unedifying, and we know that divided parties don't win elections. And the Labour Party had to prove that they were not like the Tories, and at the moment they're increasingly acting like they are.
Well, there's no doubt that Tory division has damaged their poll rating. People are sick of the chaos. There were people worried in focus groups a couple of months ago we were going to get another new Prime Minister. And they would say about Labour, even if they were still undecided, well, they do seem more united. They do seem more like a team. Yeah. And so I actually think, you can underplay, ultimately selections are a bit of a Westminster story, but it's the general perception that bleeds out of, is Keir Starmer, is he a decent man in the way he treats people, and in terms of the division in the party.
OK, thank you. And just a bit of breaking news. The Biden administration has partly lifted the ban on Ukraine using weapons donated by Western nations against targets which are in Russian territory. That is a very, very interesting developing line there. Luke, is there any interest left amongst voters on international relations issues, particularly the war in Ukraine? And is there any harm in still committing many millions to supporting Kyiv?
The really interesting thing is we had some data back on this earlier this week, is that support for Ukraine in the UK, unlike other countries, has remained resolute. 74% of Brits think it matters to the UK that Ukraine wins. And when we ask them, how long do you think we should keep supporting Ukraine for? Most people say at least until they've got the territory back that they lost in 2022 to Russia. So, and we're quite unique in that. We pull in other countries too. And, the US much more divided about it, and continental Europe more divided. But in Britain, this narrative, which is cross-party as well, has really become imbued that Ukraine must win and we must support them to do it.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. I mean, we've been trying to catch you out for the last hour on every single aspect of this election. You are having absolutely none of it. You're across all the detail. And it's been a really, really interesting, wide-ranging and very deep and enriching conversation. I have learnt a lot. I think the listeners have as well. Thank you very much indeed. Enjoy the rest of the campaign. We may get you back in before the end of it.
Please do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke. Coming up, Well, this was interesting because Nikki from Kent just raised this issue, which she alluded to, about the fact that no one's really talking about Brexit in this election, are they? Now, the EU is said that it is open to deepen ties with a future Labour government, but it will not offer the UK any radical concessions. They've got other things on their mind. They've moved on. They don't want to go down this whole road again. They've got better things to be doing. But a leading business organisation has said that current arrangements are throttling investment and growth in this country, and that this is the elephant in the room that no one's addressing. And my question, therefore, is this: why are none of the national parties talking about how Brexit is going and our relationship with the EU?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, a government minister's told LBC he's certain workers will face no tax rises if the Conservatives are re-elected. But Anthony Brown has admitted there'll need to be cuts on public spending.
The point of being in power and being in government is you make these tough decisions about where you spend money and how you balance between tax cuts and making sure people have more of their own money and spending on public services.
Labour says it wants to lower taxes for workers and would pay for its promises with things like taxes on energy companies and private schools. There's been another defection from Labour to the Conservatives, to Labour. Mark Logan, who won the constituency of Bolton North East for the Tories in 2019, says he believes Sir Keir Starmer's party will bring renewed enthusiasm and optimism. Elsewhere in campaigning today, the Lib Dems want more mental health workers in schools. The SNPs accuse Westminster of robbing young people's opportunities. Reform UK wants to put businesses off taking on overseas workers. In other news, and we're just hearing that President Joe Biden has partially lifted the ban on Ukraine using US arms in strikes on Russian territory to defend Kharkiv. That there, according to US officials. A woman who stabbed her partner to death and buried his body in their garden in Northampton has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 20 years. Fiona Beale, who's 50, admitted to the murder of 42-year-old Nicholas Billingham. His partly mummified remains were discovered 4.5 months after he was last seen in November 2021. Outside the Old Bailey, Detective Constable Kim McHugh read a statement on behalf of Mr Billingham's mother.
Behind her facade is a kindly schoolteacher. She was secretly planning the cold-blooded killing of Nick. Once the deed was done, she went to great lengths to conceal his body, dumping him in an impromptu grave like rubbish, before carrying on with her life as if nothing had happened.
A 9-year-old girl's in a critical condition after being the innocent victim of a drive-by shooting in Hackney in East London. 3 men are said to be in a stable condition in hospital. And it's understood the King will take part in the Trooping the Colour ceremony, but will inspect the soldiers from a carriage rather than on horseback. Charles has recently returned to public-facing duties while still receiving treatment for cancer. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 48 points at 82.31. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.18. LBC weather: showers easing this evening, some rain along North Sea coasts and a low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Ali Miraj.
Very good evening to you if you're just joining us. It's 3 minutes past 9. It's Ali Miraj on LBC. And in this final hour, I want to talk about Europe. Yes, Europe, the EU, that whole jazz, and specifically the B word. Because no one really wants to talk about the B word these days, do they? And you know the one I'm talking about, Brexit. Yes, Brexit. None of the main parties seem to actually want to address the elephant in the room, which is basically this: what has been the outcome of the vote to leave the EU, and what should our future relationship with Europe actually be? Now, since 2016, the EU has, obviously, we've had this negotiation. It's been a very fraught period, and now it's being reported at a high level that the EU is ready to deepen ties with a future Labour government if they get elected, and they are widely assumed to probably be in pole position to win this election. But it will not offer radical concessions to Keir Starmer. EU sources are already welcoming warmer relations under Rishi Sunak and are looking cautiously at the changing political weather across the Channel here in the UK. Officials see potential for a better relationship with the UK under a Starmer government, but say that any agreements, whether on easier trade for fresh food, student exchange or youth mobility, would require the UK to accept rules and responsibilities. And it says this: if the UK is looking for a more positive relationship, they'll be pushing at an open door at this end, according to one EU diplomat, pointing out that closer ties have been on offer to successive Conservative governments. And this individual said there is potentially a lot available in terms of closer relationships, but that has been available at any time. And of course, there are responsibilities and rules attached to it from the UK side. Now, the interesting thing also is that you have business, and in particular the British Chamber of Commerce, who have said very openly that tighter migration rules, and we were talking about migration in the first hour of this programme, and rising costs and complexity of exports were throttling investment and growth at home. And they say this, and I quote, "We urgently need to get a better trading relationship with our closest neighbour," according to the British Chamber of Commerce Director General Siobhan Haviland. So business is absolutely incensed by all this. They feel that they've been sold down the river. No great dividend has actually been accrued here, and it's been a disaster. Now, in the last hour, the elections expert Luke Tryl, who was just with me for the past hour, from the More in Common think tank, he was here taking your calls, was asked about the lack of interest in Brexit from major parties and why there's hardly anybody suggesting holding another referendum on rejoining the EU.
If you ask people, has Brexit worked? Not only do Remainers say that it hasn't worked, Leavers actually now